Welcome to Chapter 7, in which safety at scene operations will be discussed. Once completed with this module, you should be able to identify and assess safety needs for both emergency and non-emergency situations, and be able to identify and analyze the major causes involved in line-of-duty deaths related to health, wellness, fitness, and vehicle operations. Change in EMS agencies is not always well received, and you are a new EMS safety officer who finds him or herself in need of addressing crew concerns that, as a part of this new position, you will be responding to all sorts of incidents to complicate things for the EMS crews. To alleviate these concerns, your EMS chief has asked that a policy be created to define the calls to which you will more than likely respond or not respond. What type of incidents do you believe should be on the list? What do you think is the most important aspect of being a safety officer? Are there any other situations, circumstances, or incidents that you believe would require your response? Any incident to which EMS responds can give rise to some type of safety compromise. This chapter covers many of the topics with which an incident safety officer will or should be concerned. Street and roadway incidents are among the most dangerous situations to which EMS responds. Every year, emergency workers are injured and killed when struck by vehicular traffic while working on the scene of motor vehicle accidents. To address these losses, the Federal Highway Administration published the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices for Streets and Highways. FEMA also published its Manual on Traffic Control for Roadway Incidents, and the Federal DOT updated requirements for high-visibility apparel while functioning on federally funded highways. The NFPA has also updated its apparatus standards to address visibility while minimizing distractions for motorists. Roadway incidents obviously present numerous challenges to emergency workers and EMS providers. Provider and scene safety must be of primary concern for emergency workers. Unfortunately, there are many scenarios in which law enforcement is more concerned with maintaining the flow of traffic, and there are many examples available on the internet of fire and EMS workers arguing with law enforcement about scene safety. This need to maintain the flow of traffic is even more pronounced on limited access highways where disruptions in traffic can have a very real economic impact on commerce. It is incumbent upon an EMS safety officer to work these concerns out with local law enforcement for a scene call on a roadway. Incident command should be utilized, and at scenes where law enforcement, fire, and EMS have diverse and various responsibilities and concerns, a unified command system may be prudent. A dedicated safety officer, if personnel allows, is also beneficial. It is easy for an EMS provider to suffer from tunnel vision when focusing on a patient. A dedicated safety officer has the ability to focus on the scene and providers to ensure operations occur as safely as possible. Even with the scene protected, unified command in place, and a dedicated safety officer on the scene, inattentive drivers, excessive speeds, unsafe roadway conditions, and numerous other factors can contribute to an already dynamic and unsafe scene. The mass of moving vehicles combined with speed creates a considerable concern for emergency workers exposed to vehicular traffic. When possible, the scene should be protected with apparatus, cones, directional arrows, and other devices. These items must also be positioned to provide ample warning to motorists while also adequately protecting the scene. The use of appropriate personal protective equipment is very important. While required on federally funded highways, the use of high-visibility garments is recommended at all roadway incidents. The use of head protection is also strongly encouraged, along with maintaining good situational awareness. When exiting vehicles, ensure you are not stepping out into traffic. Also be cautious when backing up or moving away from a scene or vehicle to avoid inadvertently stepping in front of a passing vehicle. If scene lighting is required, try to avoid the use of lighting that is directed up and out from the scene, as that kind of lighting can blind approaching motorists. Rather, scene light should be elevated and directed down onto the scene. As previously noted, vehicle standards have been updated to improve visibility for roadway operations. If you have an older vehicle, it may be worth your services while to consider applying some of these markings retroactively. Emerging research also equates emergency lighting and passing motorists to moths attracted to a flame. Especially if a motorist is impaired due to drugs, alcohol, or fatigue, there is a tendency to drift toward a distraction rather than away from it. Numerous flashing lights, including blinding white lights, can impair a driver's night vision and also draw the motorist toward, rather than away from, the scene. Many states, including Wisconsin, have laws that require motorists to move over or slow down while approaching an emergency vehicle on the roadway. Some of these laws also apply for non-emergency vehicles alongside the roadway with its hazards operating. These laws do help, but are by no means an absolute assurance of safety at these scenes. The use of traffic cones is just one step recommended by federal guidelines for emergency crews operating on the scene of a motor vehicle accident. Ambulance crews should be familiar with these guidelines well in advance of responding to an incident on the roadway. Training and coordination with other emergency service agencies, fire and law enforcement in particular, is essential to support such operations. While many fire departments provide EMS as a part of routine operations, it is also not uncommon for EMS to be provided by a separate agency. That does not minimize the importance of EMS at the scene of a building fire, however, as EMS is necessary to treat potential victims as well as providing rehab and other wellness services to firefighters. Fire departments typically have their own safety officer at the scene of structure fires, but that does not minimize the importance of an EMS safety officer on the scene. Depending on the agency, the incident safety officer may very well be the EMS safety officer. If that is not the case, however, the EMS safety officer can still provide an extra set of eyes at the scene of an incident. There are numerous forecasting tools or scene considerations that can help predict what may or may not happen at the scene of a structure fire. Even non-fire EMS providers may have input that can prove valuable to fire crews at a structure fire. It is a nationwide trend that EMS calls for service typically eclipse the number of fire calls serviced by an agency. While fire departments routinely pre-plan buildings with their respective jurisdictions, it is likely that EMS crews have a better familiarity with many buildings within the fire department's response area, given frequent routine responses to many of these buildings for medical alarms. EMS providers may have knowledge about special building features, along with information about paths of access and egress for fire crews. While EMS providers are not typically concerned with the construction or age of the building, features associated with the construction type or age of the building may still be known to EMS providers. Back rooms, elevators, tight staircases, locked areas, remodeled areas, and other building elements could play a significant role in the development of tactics for evacuating occupants or fighting a fire within a building. Working proactively with local fire departments and fire crews before an incident can be of tremendous benefit to everyone once a building is actually on fire. Firefighters routinely receive training on how to read smoke, and even if an EMS provider is not a firefighter, there can still be some benefit in being familiar with the 4 attributes of smoke. These attributes will be discussed momentarily. Lastly, even if an EMS crew or provider is not involved in the direct extinguishment of a fire, many of the strategic priorities for the fire department are the same, especially the desire to preserve life. Whether the lives protected are those of the building occupants, general public, or the emergency workers on the scene, EMS plays a critical role in protecting all lives on the scene of a structure fire. With that being said, it is also important to recognize the importance of EMS within the incident command system and the principles of crew integrity and scene accountability. EMS crews should function in the area to which they are assigned by the incident commander. Freelancing, which occurs when crews take their own initiative to function in a particular role at a given location on the scene, is not allowed. There are numerous hazards at a fire scene, not the least of which being the potential for structural collapse, along with concerns related to individual exposure to carcinogens and other hazardous materials. EMS crews must not exceed their scope or mandate while on the scene of a structure fire. In discussing the 4 attributes of smoke, the color, thickness, pressure, and amount of smoke can all be telltale signs for an experienced firefighter trying to determine what may happen next. The color of the smoke can be used to formulate an understanding of the stage of burning within the fire, or may give some clue as to the fuel feeding the fire. Some fuels, such as hydrocarbons, oil-based, can elevate concerns for fire crews as those fuels may burn hotter or faster than more natural combustibles. The thickness of the smoke is gauged to determine the quality and continuity of burning. Heavy, thick smoke is commonly associated with a fire that has ample fuel and oxygen to support continued or expanded combustion. The pressure associated with the smoke refers to the amount of force with which the smoke is exiting the structure. The more forceful the smoke is exiting the building, the more intense the fire is assumed to be. Lastly, the amount of smoke, which is different from the thickness of the smoke, is thought to relate to the amount of combustibles involved in the fire. More smoke is associated with more fuel. Again, firefighters typically receive considerable education and training on reading smoke, and emerging research from Underwriters Laboratories and the National Institute for Standards and Technology are constantly updating science's understanding of how buildings and their content burn. While EMS may not be heavily involved in the development or implementation of fireground strategies and tactics, reporting unusual conditions to command can still be valuable, as even seasoned firefighters and incident commanders can miss something on a chaotic fire scene. The inclusion and roles of EMS on a fire scene will vary considerably depending on the organizations involved. Fire-based EMS providers may be cross-trained to fight fires as well as provide EMS services. Other standalone EMS agencies may employ providers with no fire-based training or experience. Regardless of the anticipated role to be filled by EMS providers at a fire scene, it is beneficial for those EMS providers to train with local fire agencies to ensure effective scene operations at a structure fire. Wildland fire operations are typically very different than structural fire operations. These incidents are commonly larger in both scope and duration, which brings its own unique set of challenges to bear. With that being said, EMS is no less important in these operations. In larger scale operations, both aviation operations as well as vehicular operations are common. Given elevated levels of stress over a sustained operational period, firefighters may be at greater risk of heart attacks or other physical ailments. In areas with high fuel loads and dry conditions, wildland fires can spread rapidly. The human element is also important to consider, as some residents may not want to evacuate or fire crews become trapped by an unanticipated growth or movement of the fire. It is also not unusual for large-scale wildfires to involve numerous fire service agencies across a wide geographical area. Some of these areas may be difficult to reach by means other than hiking or even parachuting in. These facets can make the providing of EMS services all the more difficult. Some areas of the country never deal with wildfires, while it is a constant risk for others. EMS agencies must be familiar with the fire risks faced within their respective response territories and work proactively with local fire service agencies to ensure coordination of efforts and services in the safest, most efficient manner possible. Another routine operational consideration for EMS agencies is that of infectious diseases. OSHA requires every healthcare agency, including EMS agencies, to have an exposure control plan in place to address the prevention of infectious disease transmission. The plan must include steps for making a determination as to whether or not an exposure actually occurred, identification of different methods of compliance with infectious control policies, procedures, and protocols, engineering and work practice controls that are in place or available to providers to prevent infectious disease transmission, housekeeping requirements, which includes the decontamination procedures for the ambulance and EMS equipment, and the process for handling medical waste, especially when bodily fluids are involved. Each organization must have an infection control officer. In many EMS organizations, the EMS safety officer fills this role, although that need not be the case. Employers must make hepatitis B vaccinations available to personnel at no cost and must also provide post-exposure evaluation and follow-up in the event of a significant exposure. Other immunizations may also be provided to personnel or may be required by state or local laws. EMS organizations must ensure that all personnel with potential occupational exposure to bloodborne pathogens and infectious diseases are provided with annual training at no cost to the employee to minimize the likelihood of an exposure. The training should include information on bloodborne pathogens, infectious disease control and prevention, and also cover the details of the agency's exposure control plan. Patient handling is also another routine EMS operation that can lead to safety and health concerns, as well as legal liability for an EMS crew and the service. There are two primary safety and health concerns that exist within the realm of patient handling. The first relates to the safety of the patient. Once an EMS crew packages a patient, that patient commonly must place full faith and confidence in the EMS crew, as the patient is no longer able to move or ambulate on his or her own. The dropping of patients is therefore not only unfortunate but unacceptable. Unfortunately, patient drops do occur for a variety of reasons. The first reason is improper maintenance of equipment. Corrosion on a cot or scoop stretcher can create issues for a crew, especially if that corrosion affects movable components such as wheels or hinges. Some ambulances have airbags that deflate to lower the back of the ambulance when loading or unloading a cot. Given the height of some ambulances, a failure of that system can create significant challenges when loading or unloading a patient. Whether the issue arises due to improper maintenance or the equipment simply fails or malfunctions without warning, the negative impact to the patient and possibly the providers can be significant. The improper use of equipment can also lead to issues for EMS providers and their patients. Ongoing training is important to ensure providers are up to speed on the use of new equipment and techniques. Improper balance or strength can result in patient drops as well. Having the short, dainty provider loading the 300-plus pound patient by him or herself is just asking for trouble. Navigating obstacles such as uneven surfaces or stairs can cause a provider to lose his or her balance as well. For that reason, having more than just two providers on a cot can be a necessity to ensure the safe movement of a patient. Provider haste can also lead to patient drops when the crew is in too much of a hurry or is not focusing adequately on the task at hand. This also ties in with provider fatigue and complacency. Some aspects of the job can become routine and mundane, such as the lifting and moving of patients, which is something EMS providers do every single day. Trying to take shortcuts when tired on a 2 a.m. call can result in injuries and errors in patient care, as can a lack of attentiveness given complacency. As difficult as it can be sometimes, EMS providers must strive to maintain a constant state of alertness and attention to detail at all times when providing patient care. These same issues can also result in injuries to providers. Slips, falls, loss of balance, equipment malfunctions can create unsafe conditions that negatively impact the safety and health of providers. The nature of the job itself, which includes the lifting of patients, comes with its own inherent challenges as back injuries are prevalent in EMS. Training providers to use proper lifting techniques while also employing the use of engineering controls such as powered cots and other lifting devices can go a long way in protecting your providers from unfortunate and expensive back injuries. Looking at this picture, do you see any potential issues? Unless there is a contraindication, a stair chair would be easier for navigating the stairs as opposed to using a cot. The person walking backward down the stairs would also benefit from a spotter, as a single misstep could result in significant injury to both the patient as well as the provider. If the cot is not powered, the lowering of the patient down to the ground before extending the cot legs must occur with proper lifting mechanics in mind. Without more details, it is not clear whether or not other safety precautions could have or should have been employed in this particular picture. As an EMS provider or safety officer, however, it is important to routinely consider these safety elements in routine practice to minimize risk to both providers and patients alike. Given the epidemic of obesity in the United States, the use of specially equipped bariatric ambulances is becoming more commonplace in many communities. For those services without such resources, it is critical to consider other means for keeping providers and their patients safe when moving heavier patients. Given the prevalence of back injuries within EMS, along with the costs associated with those injuries in terms of provider health and wellness, in addition to lost time and money, it is important to emphasize and train on the use of proper lifting mechanics. Considerations when lifting a patient include thinking through the situation, anticipation and troubleshooting of tight corners, stairs, and elevators, and utilizing better alternative routes when available, determining which partner will lead during the lift, communicating clearly with all those involved in the lift, checking for adequate footing, staying balanced, using the legs and not the back when lifting, exhaling during exertion, keeping the weight as close to the body as possible, and knowing one's own limits. If additional help is needed to move a patient, the EMS crew should request it. Many hands do help lighten the proverbial load. In what is now an unfortunate reality of our daily lives, random acts of violence occur. While EMS is typically called to deal with the aftermath of such violence, there are increasing instances of EMS providers being the targets of such violence. For some, EMS providers are simply easy targets. After all, EMS providers are typically not armed and do not have the training law enforcement has to defend themselves. Unlike fire crews that commonly consist of 3 or more people, it is not unusual for an EMS crew to consist of only 2 people. During transport, there may be a single EMS provider in the back of the ambulance with the patient. There can be safety in numbers, and EMS providers simply do not have those numbers in most situations. For others who wish to do us harm, EMS providers are agents of the government, which makes them the object of scorn and ridicule. EMS providers typically wear uniforms, which means we are authority figures in the eyes of the public. Sometimes, those EMS providers are confused with law enforcement. In truly egregious situations, EMS providers are targeted to reduce the survivability of those who were previously injured in what was probably a coordinated act of violence or terrorism. Regardless of the reasons, EMS providers must be aware of the potential to be targets for violence. These attacks can also occur in virtually any environment. There are cases in which someone tried to strike EMS providers with a car on the roadway. This occurred once at a Fill the Boot event where a motorist intentionally ran over and killed a firefighter. Individual residences are not automatically safe, especially considering that everyone has knives and other impromptu weapons in their homes, firearms included. Some responses involve domestic disturbances, and EMS providers, who may be there to help, can become victims of violence themselves, as an emotionally charged atmosphere can breed an already volatile set of circumstances. When approaching a call at a residence, EMS providers should pay close attention to the scene. Some warning signs of danger could include past history of problems or violence at the residence, known drug or gang activity in the area, loud noises or items breaking, seeing or hearing fighting, intoxication or drug use, evidence of dangerous pets, or even an unusually dark or silent residence. Domestic abuse situations can be challenging as well, given that such abuse may be physical, emotional, sexual, verbal, or even economic. In those instances, the perpetrator of the abuse typically has a vested interest in ensuring EMS does not become aware of the abuse. Apparent fear of a household member, different conflict counts by parties at the scene, one party preventing another from speaking, a patient reluctant to speak, injuries that do not match the reported mechanism of injury, or unusual or unsanitary living conditions or hygiene can all be subtle signs of abuse. Even if suspected, at no time should the EMS crew confront the perpetrator about the suspected abuse, lest the EMS crew make themselves potential targets. Try to remove the victim from the environment and involve the police. Clandestine drug labs are also possible in even small or well-to-do communities. These labs are often located within homes, apartments, or even extended stay rooms. The problem with these labs is that they are, by their very definition, clandestine. There are no NFPA 704 placards posted to inform emergency responders of hazards on the property. It is very possible an EMS crew can be walking into a very dangerous situation without even realizing it. As a result, EMS providers should always keep an eye out for potential signs of a hazardous environment, such as the presence of chemical odors, chemistry equipment such as glassware, chemical containers, heating mantles, and burners, suspicious persons, activities, and deliveries, and other features at the residence such as ample privacy, utilities, and ventilation. Aside from violence, toxic inhalation from clandestine drug labs is a real threat to EMS providers. If a lab is identified, EMS personnel should leave the area immediately and notify law enforcement, making sure they understand the situation. A trained hazardous materials team will be needed to mitigate the scene. Violent groups or circumstances can also give rise to concern. Providing treatment to people during a civil disturbance, for instance, can be very hazardous. Providing aid to someone shot during a gang fight is another example of a dangerous situation, especially if the perpetrator may still be in the area. Beyond that, EMS providers are often called to provide treatment to the sick and injured at crime scenes. Sometimes those crime scenes are not entirely safe, especially in today's day and age of active shooters and assailants. In those cases, the public's expectation is that EMS crews will be actively trying to save lives as opposed to stay a mile away from the incident while waiting for police to eventually secure the scene. When functioning at a crime scene, EMS crews should also be mindful of potentially disturbing evidence that exists on the scene. EMS providers should touch only what is required for patient care and document that for the police. Wear gloves, not participating in patient care to minimize the possibility of leaving fingerprints on the scene. Also be mindful as the wearing of gloves will not prevent the spoliation of evidence, such as other fingerprints on the scene, if the providers are not cognizant of maintaining the integrity of the crime scene for law enforcement. It is now becoming a trend for EMS agencies to change their uniforms to ensure they are not mistaken for law enforcement, which hopefully reduces the likelihood of them being targets for violence. Some services are also purchasing body armor for EMS to wear during hazardous incidents. While we have focused on violence that occurs at the scene of a call, EMS workers are not immune from workplace violence, and services must take proactive steps to ensure a safe and healthy workplace includes one in which workplace violence is not tolerated. Police officers are trained on how to approach vehicles, and EMS providers should employ some of the same practices. Never approach a potentially violent situation if it can be avoided. When approaching a vehicle, doing so from the passenger side of the vehicle is a good practice to provide greater visibility of the driver. If the vehicle is pulled over on the right side of the road, approaching the passenger side also removes the EMS provider from the flow of traffic. In what is a growing trend, some people are using their vehicles to serve as gas chambers for suicide by mixing specific chemicals within the vehicle that then creates a toxic atmosphere. In many of these situations, there may be no warning upon cursory examination of the vehicle. If a person appears unconscious in a vehicle with closed windows, a quick examination of the vehicle's interior is prudent to check for the presence of chemicals within the vehicle. For EMS agencies with active gangs in their response territory, it is important to be aware of warning signs in the area. Graffiti will often be used to mark gang territory, and many gangs identify themselves through the use of clothing and symbols. Your local law enforcement agency may prove to be a valuable resource by providing training on potential gang issues within your agency's area. Coordinating efforts with local law enforcement is important where the risk of violence is concerned, especially when responding to victims of potential gang crime. There are some other tactics EMS should consider when faced with a potentially violent circumstance. First, consider the difference between concealment and cover. Concealment is just that. It conceals your presence from another. Concealment is not cover, however. Cover not only conceals, but it shields the person from violent intent. Hiding behind a bush, for instance, may be concealment, but that bush will not stop a bullet. Hiding behind a brick and concrete building, however, provides cover against many smaller firearms. Distraction and evasive tactics can also be employed. If necessary to run from an armed assailant, for instance, doing so in a zigzag pattern makes it more difficult to be shot, although it can be slower if the assailant is pursuing you. Along these lines, many services are now working with their local law enforcement agencies to provide tactical EMS in the proverbial hot zone of an active assailant incident. Within Wisconsin, TEMS teams require an operational plan on file with the Department of Human Services EMS office, along with specialized training and law enforcement involvement. The training provided by TEMS has had the cursory benefit of providing law enforcement and EMS providers with improved trauma skills and equipment that can be used in other nonviolent situations as well. In many areas, the TEMS concept has morphed into something known as rescue task forces, in which law enforcement and EMS providers work together in the warm zone to rapidly extricate victims from active assailant environments. While not as formal as a TEMS team, adequate training and pre-planning with local law enforcement is an absolute must for the relative safe operation of such task forces. As mentioned briefly before, some services are now going so far as to equip EMS providers with bulletproof vests, which provide protection from most handguns and knives. The vests have been shown to also reduce the impact of blunt trauma from objects such as a steering wheel if involved in a motor vehicle collision. Some have argued that if an EMS provider needs a bulletproof vest, the provider is too close to the violent situation. Unfortunately, there are also a growing number of cases where EMS providers were unknowingly called into a violent situation and could have benefited from a vest, even if only to try and escape the dangerous situation. Unfortunately, while EMS providers are there to help, not everyone wants that help or considers that help to be a good thing. Maintaining good situational awareness is important, as is the use of law enforcement assets when necessary. As an EMS agency leader or manager, your job will be to provide adequate training to your providers while also laying the foundation with law enforcement and other agencies to keep your providers as safe as possible from acts of violence. As if that wasn't enough, EMS providers are often called to the scene of hazardous materials incidents as well. According to the National EMS Educational Standards, every EMS provider should have operations-level hazardous materials training, although many areas provide only awareness-level training. Regardless of the level of training received, the EMS agency must ensure the providers have the equipment necessary to perform their jobs during a hazardous materials incident. Routinely, this means providing rehabilitation and medical surveillance for those emergency responders directly mitigating the hazardous materials incident. Providing care for medical emergencies is also important, whether that be for another responder or a member of the general public. Many ground-based ambulance services do not give much thought to air-based EMS, but those providers and services are just as critical to EMS, especially in rural or remote areas where ambulance transport times are excessive. Unfortunately for those in the aeromedical EMS field, the number of accidents nearly doubled between the mid-1990s and the air-based EMS industry's rapid growth period from 2000 to 2004. To address this statistic, the FAA is moving to a risk-based system that includes the initiatives outlined in the following sections, including weather, night vision goggles, flight data recorders, terrain awareness warning systems, and helicopter safety. Within those initiatives, the FAA funded the development and implementation of a graphical flight planning tool for ceiling and visibility assessment along direct flights in areas with limited capability for surface observations. The FAA also has a solid record of facilitating safety improvements and new technologies for EMS helicopters, including certification of night vision goggles. With that being said, flight data recorders are not required for HEMS operations. Terrain awareness systems are also not mandated, although the FAA supports voluntary implementation of those systems. It is also common for ground ambulance services to interface with air-based services, and training on safe helicopter operations is necessary for the establishment of landing zones and safe operation of personnel within and around such a landing zone. If your agency is served by an aeromedical service, it is a good idea to arrange training with that service on a regular basis to ensure safe operations around the helicopter and any landing zone established by the ground-based service. There are also fixed-wing ambulance services in some areas, but those services must land at an airport, which minimizes the need for EMS providers to be trained on landing zone operations within those agencies. Returning to the scenario at the start of this module, it is important to recognize that an EMS safety officer is just one person. It is not possible for you to respond to all incidents. Rather, your primary goal is to provide adequate training to your personnel so that everyone functions as a safety officer to a certain extent. With that being said, you may want to identify incidents with the highest potential of injury and include them on the list of incidents to which you will respond. Additionally, if a patient is dropped, a significant exposure occurs, or a provider is injured, there should be a reporting mechanism in place that notifies you or someone else on the chain of command if you are not available about the occurrence. Depending on the circumstances, you may want to respond to such incidents. With the information from this chapter, you should now be able to describe the purpose of the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices for Streets and Highways, explain the guidelines for safe parking when operating in or near moving traffic, describe forecasting tools used to evaluate the status of a burning building, list the elements within an exposure control plan, describe ways to decrease back injuries and patient drops when lifting and moving patients, identify the components of a workplace violence prevention program, Identify the training necessary for hazardous materials responders to work within the hot zone. Discuss at least 2 recommendations the FAA has proposed to reduce medical helicopter crashes, and evaluate your organization's operational safety policies to determine shortcomings and propose solutions.